أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك إني كنت من الظالمين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يا حي يا قيوم برحمتك أستغيث لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك إني كنت من الظالمين ربنا آتنا من لدنك رحمة وهيئ لنا من أمرنا رشدا. So, dopamine of dunya versus serotonin of sabr. Dunya is Arabic for this world, planet Earth, and everything that's part of planet Earth that helps us sustain life and progress from the moment we are born to the second we die, at the individual and collective level. Sabr is patience. This is the emotional and behavioural response to adversity, to situations where a reward, for example, is delayed or a punishment must be avoided. So patience is exercised. And patience is a virtue, famous English idiom. But today I'll be exploring Islam and neuroscience, breaking down complex ideas in loose and lucid language for everyone, including myself, to grasp these concepts much better. I'll keep it concise and also comprehensive. So, first question is, why we chase pleasure and struggle with patience? Why are we designed in such a way? And what has caused us to be in this constant cycle where we want, we get, we want more, and we get that, and we constantly are in this loop? Well, if we look at Surah Al-Isra, verse number 11, so this is chapter number 17, verse number 11, Allah informs us of how we are always drawn towards the immediate, though we paint a picture always with the future in mind. And this is quite fascinating, this ayah, which I would love to share. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ويدعو الإنسان بالشر دعاءه بالخير وكان الإنسان عجولا. This approximates to English as, the prayer that man should make for good, he maketh for evil, for man is given to hasty deeds. Footnote: man in his ignorance or haste mistakes evil for good and desires what he should not have. The wise and instructed soul has patience and does not put its own desires above the wisdom of Allah. He receives with contentment the favors of Allah and prays to be rightly guided in his desires and petitions. So this also reminded me of a very fascinating quote by Seneca, well-known Stoic philosopher, in his book The Shortness of Life, right here. And I would like to read what he has to say with respect to patience and how we tend to be immortal in our desires and dreams, but mortal when we are faced with adversity and hardship. So, I quote, "You are living as if destined to live forever. Your own frailty never occurs to you. You don't notice how much time has already passed, but squander it as though you had a full and overflowing supply. Though all the while, that very day which you are devoting to somebody or something may be your last. You act like mortals in all that you fear, and like immortals in all that you desire. You will hear many people saying, 'When I am 50, I shall retire into leisure. When I am 60, I shall give up public duties.' And what guarantee do you have of a longer life? Who will allow your course to proceed proceed as you arrange it. Aren't you ashamed to keep for yourself just the remnants of your life and to devote to wisdom only that time which cannot be spent on any business? How late it is to begin really to live just when life must end. How stupid to forget our mortality and put off sensible plans to our 50th and 60th years, aiming to begin life from a point at which few have arrived. So it's quite a potent perspective, I must say, and Seneca definitely nails the point in terms of existence and the finite amount of time we have. And within this finite amount of time, we must make the most in terms of praying to Allah and make dua, supplication for the good. In fact, time is emphasized, and Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was once asked, when is the day of judgment? And the hadith states that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam raised the right hand and the index and middle finger together and stated that myself and the day of judgment are as close as these two fingers. So there is certainly an indication that the day of judgment is not too far and closing and edging towards becoming the reality that the Qur'an constantly emphasizing, as well as some other religions as well. So this then reminded me of another ayah in Surah Qiyamah, verse number 20, which is the following. And this also will make you understand a bit more what Seneca was trying to say, but more importantly what Allah is telling us. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم كلا بل تحبون العاجلة صدق الله العظيم. So this approximates to English as, nay more, it is for us to explain it and make it clear. Sorry, that's verse 19. Verse 20. Nay, you men, but you love the fleeting life. And footnote states, man loves haste and things of haste. For that reason he pins his faith on transitory things that come and go, and neglects the things of lasting moment, which come slowly, and whose true import will only be fully seen in the hereafter. So verse 20 of chapter 75 is stating that man loves the fleeting life. He loves the short-term pleasures, the instant pleasures he gets. That's why industries like gambling, alcohol, drugs, entertainment, and these things are massive industries, because they exploit and capitalize on the impatience of man. And this is one of the reasons why such activities are haram. You can't indulge in such things. And time, as I mentioned, is emphasized here, where fleeting is the most suitable explanation here, really. And man's impatient nature and often instability of emotions is also taken into account. So another ayah I would love to share is from Surah Al-Ma'arij, ayah 19 to 21. Just gonna pull it out here. Ma'arij 1524. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Chapter 70 verses 19 to 21. إن الإنسان خلق هلوعا إذا مسه الشر جزوعا وإذا مسه الخير منوعا. This approximates to English as: truly man was created very impatient, fretful when evil touches him, and niggardly when good reaches him. So according to the footnotes, man, according to the plan of Allah, was to be in the best of molds. But in order to fulfill his high destiny, he was given free will to a limited extent. The wrong use of this free will make his nature weak or hasty or impatient, as here. That becomes his nature by his own act, but he is spoken of as so created because of the capacities given to him in his creation. The next footnote here is: in adversity he complains and gets into despair. In prosperity he becomes arrogant and forgets other people's rights and his own shortcomings. So that's very natural. When we are facing adversity, difficult situations, and our shortcomings, our weaknesses are to a large degree exposed, we panic, we are in a state of fear and often shocked. So in such situations, we are reminded that we are, number one, human, number two, nothing is entirely in our control, and number three, we have to be far more calculated and careful and have tawakkul, trust in Allah, when such a similar situation arises again. Because the life of a Muslim really and truly is not an easy one. And for those Muslims who think their life is pretty comfortable and easy, best believe tough times are either coming ahead or the ultimate test, which is this life, and you will be accounted for in the day of judgment. That day will be difficult. So in either case, you must be prepared. You must be prepared for adversity and the test that Allah will put you through. As mentioned in Surah Al-Baqarah, in fact, Allah states that He will test us with our children, with our wealth, with our health, and hunger and poverty. So it's imperative that we understand the Qur'an and the world around us. So in such case, I took it upon myself to understand how dopamine and serotonin really have a special place when it comes to the Islamic approach to this world of materialism and consumerism that we are currently living in. And it's always been, even in ancient civilizations. Excuse me, alhamdulillah. And number two, the serotonin aspect when it comes to patience and understanding your own weaknesses and being able to control your impulses, right? So, as I mentioned, adversity relates to serotonin. This yields patience and gives us an index of activities, what we must do. For example, our habits, our diet, our body, our money, our relationships, time we spend, time we waste, so on and so forth. Prosperity and pleasure and also arrogance has a closer relationship with dopamine. And this is essentially a fast train that is moving towards evil if it's not stopped in its tracks. So, how does neuroscience play into this? Well, in its simplest terms, dopamine is associated with instant pleasure and serotonin with long-term peace. So I'll begin with dopamine, its definition, and share some texts with yourself. So inshallah you gain some value, and any additional value that you see will be appreciated. So according to the APA dictionary, in terms of dopamine, a catecholamine neurotransmitter that has an important role in motor behavior and is implicated in numerous mental conditions and emotional states. It is found in dopaminergic neurons in the brain and elsewhere. It is synthesized from the dietary amino acid tyrosine, which in the first rate-limiting stage of the reaction is converted to L-dopa by the enzyme tyrosine hydroxylase. L-dopa is then transformed into dopamine by the enzyme dopa decarboxylase. In non-dopaminergic neurons and the adrenal medulla, so this is near the kidneys, dopamine is further metabolized to form norepinephrine and epinephrine respectively. Destruction of the dopaminergic neurons in a substantia nigra is responsible for the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Example given: rigidity and tremors. Blockade of the action of dopamine in other brain regions accounts for the therapeutic activities of many psychotic drugs. So I think that meant antipsychotic drugs. So if you're curious to know the areas of the brain that are responsible for dopamine pathways, I'll attach a picture from Wolfram Schultz's paper. But principally, the area of the striatum is responsible, and not just the striatum. You also have other structures, as you can see on the picture. The amygdala, which is responsible for emotional processing, the orbital frontal cortex, which is near the vision area, and obviously the maroon areas that you see in the image, which is the visual cortex, the cerebellum, spinal cord as well. So these in unison release reward signals and signals that allow dopamine to be released and help us experience pain, pleasure, and wanting more and wanting more. So to give some examples here, dopamine is released when one eats junk food, for example, your pizzas and your burgers and your kebabs and your paratha and so on. Likes on social media, high levels of engagement online. If, for example, you win money in gambling and betting, and watching something that's entertaining, for example, that's funny or cute, or something that is relatable in a funny way, such as pranks. And so this creates a high but quickly fades away eventually. And this makes us want to crave more and crave more. And based upon this behavior, psychologists teaming up with food companies, beverage companies, technology companies, gaming companies have figured out a way for us to constantly re-engage, engage and re-engage, engage and re-engage. So this is why these addictions trap people in that dopamine loop. But why is this a problem? The question is, why is this a problem? Well, this is a problem because it doesn't stop just at satisfaction. It's the situation where it's the need for wanting more and more and more, and this is incremental with each passing moment. And as I mentioned, companies and often individuals exploit this, and it's very easy to manipulate individuals by releasing of dopamine. For example, in games, we see this as well. So what is a dopamine loop, right? Dopamine loop is also known as the compulsion loop or the reward loop. And this is a habitual chain of activities that one is compelled to repeat, right? And typically this loop is designed to create a neurochemical reward in the user, i.e. release of dopamine. So for example, the compulsion loop in video games, as you can see on your screen here in a moment. So, for example, in video games, the anticipation, which is to buy improved gear, for example, Fortnite, GTA, Red Dead Redemption 2, FIFA, all these games where you enhance your team or character, and then you have a challenge, for example, killing monsters, and then You have the reward, which is gold, loot, coins, player packs, improved ammo, different types of wearables, and also extra points, higher XP, so on and so forth. So it's this dopamine loop, i.e. a compulsion loop, that we are kept in the context of video games. Now, another simple example is, in terms of wanting more and more, is the idea of the hedonic treadmill. So let's explore this. This is actually the observed tendency of humans to quickly return to a relatively stable level of happiness or even sadness at times. And despite major positive or negative events or life changes, right? So for example, as a person makes more money, expectations and desires rise in tandem. For example, you have a BMW 3 Series and you have a 2-bedroom apartment. Now, if for instance your income is increased by not 5%, but 5-fold, it's 5x, you now want to have a 4-bedroom apartment, possibly a house, and another car or a better car. For example, let's say a Range Rover or a BMW 6 Series. And then it keeps on growing and growing from there, right? And this results in no permanent gain in happiness. So this idea of hedonic treadmill complements the perspective, the opinion that money does not buy happiness. I'm of that opinion. I do, however, believe that material gain and resources aid your existence and how you navigate in this world, but I don't think it's entirely the bottom line, i.e. defining your absolute emotions, happiness, sadness, disgust, joy, so on and so forth. And this reminds me actually of what Hebb speaks of regarding arousal and changes in levels. So the reference is actually from his paper from 1955, okay? And here I like to give you an idea of what people and scientists and researchers shortly after World War II were thinking about. So as you can see, level of arousal, the x-axis, and level of Q function, which is the y-axis. When you're in deep sleep, there's a sharp increase, and as soon as you wake up, shortly after, there is an increase in alertness and interest and positive emotion. That's why I choose not to use my mobile phone to look at, for example, social media in terms of updates of the atrocities going on around the world because of the tiny hat coin clipping people. But in any case, what happens is, as this rises throughout the day, there's an optimal level of response and learning. Generally speaking, this would be between the hours of 8 a.m. all the way up to 2 to 3 p.m. And I say these times because if you look at the duration of salah, you wake up for Fajr. For example, these days it's almost 6:20 a.m. And in that case, you have to be by sunrise 6:20 a.m. and from that point up until sun being at its peak, and then when it slowly sets, and then when it's completely set, which is Salatul Maghrib, time of Maghrib, you can see the drop in emotional disturbance and anxiety. I guess this is the reason, because as the day comes to an end, we are thinking, what have I achieved? What have I done? So on and so forth. But what I would say is, in respect to this particular graph, this is what I found in the Psychobiology of Personality by Marvin Zuckerman. He says the following: the relationship between affect or performance and physiological arousal are not necessarily linear. Hebb suggested that both positive effect and efficiency of performance generally occur at an optimal intermediate level of arousal, whereas unpleasant feeling states and inefficient learning or performance are more characteristic at very low or high states of arousal. Hebb's theory is a descendant of earlier models, proposing inverted U-shape relationships between stimulus intensity and effect, and between muscle tension and learning efficiency. So Wundt is considered one of the first psychologists. I don't think so. I believe the first psychologist was certainly Ibrahim alayhi salam, in my humble opinion, because of the influence he not only has around the world in terms of Christianity, Judaism and Islam, but also his various stories and interactions with people, his close family members, and those he stood up against to struggle and fight in the way of Allah. So, fascinating stuff by Hebb, and I encourage everyone to understand a bit more about this aspect, because research into such neurobiological understandings of our behavior started shortly after World War II, and then of course shortly after these studies things like MK Ultra came into existence. So moving on from here, now we expand on the role of dopamine, right? So I would like to actually consider some fascinating work presented by David Radish in his book The Mind Within the Brain. This is one of my favorite books I'm reading this year, and I would like to read just a couple pages here, which are the following. Dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, and another related neurotransmitter, octopamine, are all related chemicals from a family called the catecholamines. Catecholamines play interesting roles in learning and decision-making in a number of very distantly related species. In insects, the positive reinforcement component is octopamine, while the negative aversion signal is dopamine. Dopamine, serotonin, and octopamine also control the activation and stopping of movement, swimming and crawling, in simple animals such as leeches, worms, and lampreys. So, just like to pause here for a second. The ayahs I mentioned earlier focuses on insan, on the human being, and this is the central discussion of today, which is the human aspects of dopamine and serotonin. But it's very fascinating how insects and animals share similarities with us in this respect. And certainly Allah did not design them by accident. There is certainly a purpose, and I believe one of the purposes of animals and insects many of us would refrain from approaching or looking into are of huge benefit and very useful in terms of understanding how humans behave, and also understanding the nervous system. So, this suggests that the role of these catecholamines in encouraging and discouraging actions has a long evolutionary history. How the roles of these catecholamines play in these other animals relate to their role in human decision making is, however, still unknown. So, how does the role of these catecholamines, the role they play in decision making is still unknown, subhanallah. So the Qur'an, as I mentioned earlier, tells us directly that man is impatient. So when it comes to decision making, we will be hasty meaning we will hurry, we will jolt towards that which is of interest and reward us. That's why, for example, living in countries like England, United States, Canada and Europe, where an occupation like sales or entrepreneurship is something that not everyone is willing to do because of the delayed gratification component, which I will explain as we progress, inshallah, and how behavioral economics actually plays a very close role when it comes to the Islamic perspective of decision making and the neuroscience of explaining these processes. Recent experiments have found that serotonin relates to the ability to hold memories across delays and to one's long-term perspective, but that serotonin does not reflect negative value prediction error signals. In contrast, norepinephrine is involved in negative effect, particularly in drug addiction, such as during opiate withdrawal. Norepinephrine bursts drive pauses in the firing of dopamine neurons, which we've seen reflect disappointment and recognition of undelivered rewards. However, other researchers have proposed that norepinephrine plays roles in attention and in representations of uncertainty. Dopamine also plays a role in vigilance and attention. So, for example, scrolling on social media, instant gratification. When you're scrolling, the fact that dopamine has now entered the forefront of your system in terms of being the main driving force, you're vigilant and you're paying attention. You're paying attention to the viral music you recognize in a particular video, right? You recognize someone in the video. You recognize an influencer. You're like, you know what? I've seen this before. And this is why, for example, things like hashtag challenge. Hashtag challenges are famous because of this. They garner attention and they utilize this attention and create a wave of activity that is boosting dopamine drives, and norepinephrine is playing a role in the attention and representation of uncertainty. What I mean is, when you look at certain videos, you're in a sense uncertain what's going to happen next. That's why you have something called hooks in short form video. Hooks is something that grabs you in. They will start usually with a negative hook or a curiosity hook or a factual hook. So these hooks allow individuals to stay engaged with the video for a minute or 2 minutes or 30 seconds or however long. As with dopamine, it is likely that both serotonin and norepinephrine carry general signals that can be used in many ways. Whether the basal ganglia are actually driving movement itself, or whether the basal ganglia are merely influencing decisions being made in the cortex, is a subject of controversy in neuroscience today. So there is still a lot of back and forth in neuroscience with respect to actual movement, that the basal ganglia, which is a group of cortical, subcortical structures, whether they drive movement itself or they influence decisions. So we know, for example, from the Islamic paradigm, that human beings are constantly getting whispers from shaitan and his demons that are around us, right? Khutuwat shaitan, the footsteps of shaitan, are constantly everywhere. So that could be in the virtual world and also in the concrete real world. So that's why we constantly have to do dhikr, which allows us to be more patient and allow us to understand the world around us and know that this world is a fleeting bargain. And we also saw in one of my live streams in Surah Al-Baqarah how Allah states in chapter 2, in one of the verses between 40 and 45, inshallah I'll display it here, where Allah mentions that, will you sell my ayahs and signs for a cheap price, i.e. selling your soul in a sense and giving up the haqq, the truth, for a piece of land, for example, or a bit of influence in some governments and some wealth that ultimately leads to destruction. And history is witness to these individuals, i.e. those Jews that are also mentioned in the Qur'an, who disrespected Allah and were very arrogant. And as I mentioned, dopamine plays a vital role when it comes to the personality aspect of arrogance and the decisions made and the actions we conduct when we are arrogant. So now I would like to draw your attention to the effects of music in particularly in the culture aspect. So here I have Culture, Mind and Brain, Emerging Concepts, Models and Application. Fantastic book by social psychologist, behavioral psychologists and neuroscientists who teamed up and compiled some fascinating findings. So I would like to share some with you, which I found very interesting when it came to reward and emotions and expectations. So before we begin, it's also important that I mention the reason I chose music is because it's been a part of everyone's lives, especially those who engage in social media. Okay, so knowing or unknowingly, music has entered your conscious mind. For example, going back to short form videos, usually there is some viral music being played in the background or some form of it. And also there are situations where there are some types of audio clips added in the background which keep you engaged and you recognize them from other videos. And that's why, for instance, dance videos are very popular because of this. And funny and relatable videos have music that compels you to view it for the full 30 to 60 seconds or so. And you continue this for the next few hours. What was supposed to be a 1 to 2 minute video, that 1 to 2 minute video becomes a 3 to 4 hour session. And here I would like to share the following. One of the major neuroscientific findings pertaining to music in the last few years has been a demonstration that much of the pleasure derived from it is mediated by the brain's reward system. This system includes the ventral tegmental area, also known as VTA, in the brainstem, the nucleus accumbens, the caudate, amygdala, orbitofrontal cortex, and other structures. We touched on this briefly before, and has been extensively characterized in various animal species as well as humans. Dopamine transmission within these structures is known to mediate responses to biologically significant inputs such as food and sexual stimuli, as well as certain drugs, example given cocaine, amphetamine, and nicotine. The reward system's engagement in music was first demonstrated in a study in which listeners were exposed to music that they selected as inducing highly pleasurable chills. Subsequent studies confirmed not only that the reward system was active during musical pleasure, but also that it involves dopamine, and that it unfolds in two phases. Now, these phases are interesting. Number 1, during the anticipation of peak pleasure, and second, during the experience of the peak pleasure itself. So, the anticipation of the peak pleasure and experiencing this peak pleasure itself. In addition, the response of the reward system to music has now been shown to be coupled to the response of perceptual areas of the brain, including the auditory cortex, leading to the idea that perceptual analysis and computation of expectancies carried out in these cortical areas interacts with the reward system's computation of the value of the stimulus. So what they are stating is that the expectancies carried out in these cortical areas through computational analysis informs us that there's an interaction between the reward system and the value of the stimulus that is reflected in the changes of the data that is processed, right? Now, when reward system activity is directly manipulated using either brain stimulation techniques or pharmacology, musical pleasure can be affected. That is, when the reward system is stimulated, it leads to greater pleasure experiences and greater physiological arousal, whereas when it is inhibited, people report less pleasure and experience less arousal. Thus, there is a direct causal link between dopaminergic activity in the reward system and both subjective and objective indicators of musical pleasure. So, in sum, music plays a huge role in culture. Studies have shown how dopamine is, again, closely related to the experience of peak pleasure and the expectant and the anticipation of peak pleasure. So the experience and the anticipation. So we see this again in not only social media but consumption, and how, for example, private companies exploit governments and lobbyists who push certain laws and contracts, for example, weapon contracts, big pharma contracts, where they are expecting a huge payout, of course, but also the pleasure they receive from this. In other words, they are sadistic individuals. And again, this is one of the signs of the end times, that murder and death will be common. And of course, it's being perpetrated in front of our eyes. And may Allah protect those who are unable to protect themselves, and may Allah break us from the chains and shackles of these tyrants that are around us. Ameen. Now let's consider serotonin. Okay, serotonin, which I wouldn't exactly say is the opposite, but certainly an antithesis to dopamine. So, serotonin is really your brain's brake system. This allows you to slow down, relax, and makes you appreciate life, and gives true contentment, satisfaction. Okay, so according to the APA, serotonin, a common monoamine neurotransmitter in the brain, particularly the RAF nucleus, and in other parts of the central nervous system. It is also found in the gastrointestinal tract. I didn't know this. There's a connection with the stomach, the gut there. In smooth muscles of the cardiovascular and bronchial systems, and in blood platelets. It is synthesized from the dietary amino acid L-tryptophan, and in the pineal gland it is converted to melatonin, which is important for sleep. It is primarily degraded by monoamine oxidase, which yields its principal metabolic product, 5-hydroxyindoleacetic acid, 5-HIAA. Serotonin has roles in emotional processing, mood, appetite, sexual desire and performance, sleep, pain processing, hallucination, and reflex regulation. For example, levels of serotonin correlate negatively with aggression, and release of serotonin may promote sleep. It is implicated in many psychological conditions, including depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, sleep disorders, aggression, and psychosis. Many common psychotropic drugs affect neurotransmission mediated by serotonin. Also, it's called 5-hydroxytryptamine, 5-HT, which I will also step into in a moment, 5-HTA and 5-HTB, and the way a paper, which I'll use my notes, that distinguishes how these neurotransmitters modulate patience and impulsive control. So, serotonin is boosted by prayer and meditation, gratitude, helping others, and being in contact with nature, which we will see evidence of in a moment. Unlike dopamine, however, serotonin is slow, steady, and long-lasting. It remains for a long time. So it doesn't make one crave more, rather it makes one appreciate what they have. So as mentioned earlier, the content aspect of one's day-to-day life is where serotonin plays a very influential role. And I would love to share an ayah from Surah Al-Ra'd, which is chapter 13, verse number 28, which is the following. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الذين آمنوا وتطمئن قلوبهم بذكر الله ألا بذكر الله تطمئن القلوب صدق الله العظيم. This approximates to English as those who believe and whose hearts find satisfaction in the remembrance of Allah. For without doubt, in the remembrance of Allah do hearts find satisfaction. As mentioned earlier, dopamine is the antithesis to satisfaction. It's a need for wanting more and more. Serotonin is more relative to this. Now, the footnote here is, the sign or miracle is not something external. It is something internal. Something in your mind, heart and soul. It depends on your inner spiritual experience. If you turn to Allah, the light, the experience will come. If you do not, Allah will not force you. So this is the idea of free will. There's always this debate, well, there's always been this age-old debate of determinism and free will, preordained and self-done independently, right? So really and truly, Islam strikes in the middle of this particular argument. There is free will, but of course there are aspects of your qadr, your destiny, that are preordained, pre-written. However, the way you can change your destiny is by repentance, by prayer, by charity, and being patient and being satisfied with what Allah has gave you, right? I always say that I would love to have a taste of, for example, a Bentley, but then my diet will always be the rural, the farm life, inshallah. That's the ultimate life, being in touch with nature. And I found personally being more closer with nature, whether it's in the morning getting some sunlight in your eyes, all the way to eating superfoods like black seed, honey, ginger, ashwagandha, and dates, dried apricots, pumpkin seeds, and so on, are of huge benefit. Because serotonin, as we saw in the definition, also exists in your gut and your blood. So this is not, again, random evolution that came together and put all these components together in such a complicated machine, which is the human being. This is all intelligently designed by Allah. So our obligation is to worship Allah ultimately, and Allah only. Once we attempt other practices and delve deeper into other coping mechanisms designed by man, then we certainly fall into despair, anger, and become uncouth eventually. Uncouth meaning our mannerisms and etiquettes are those that are different of what Islam and the Sunnah of Muhammad ﷺ teaches us. Now let's consider a hadith of Muhammad ﷺ which highlights the importance of patience. And this is from Sahih Bukhari 6471. So I would like to highlight this, inshallah. So let me just pull this up. Bukhari. So this is from Sahih Bukhari, chapter to make the heart tender, Kitabul Raqaq. And this is the chapter refraining from doing things Allah has made illegal. So, quoted by Abu Sa'id, some people from the Ansar, who were the helpers after the Muslims were kicked out of Mecca going to Medina, asked Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to give them something, and he gave to every one of them who asked him until all that he had was finished. When everything was finished and he had spent all that was in his hand, he said to them, "Know that if I have any wealth, I will not withhold it from you to keep for somebody else. And know that he who refrains from begging others or doing prohibited deeds, Allah will make him contented and not in need of others. And he who remains patient, Allah will bestow patience upon him. And he who is satisfied with what he has, Allah will make him self-sufficient. And there is no gift better and vast you may be given than patience. Certainly patience is a virtue for that reason." And not just that, it doesn't matter what the English idiom says. Ultimately, it's what Muhammad ﷺ is saying. The greatest gift one can be given is patience. And unfortunately, majority of the world, majority of people around us, online and offline, are impatient, extremely impatient. That's why you have get-rich schemes like MLM, multi-level marketing, and cryptocurrency, forex trading, so on and so forth. There may be some truth to some of these businesses, but really and truly, over 90% of the time, it's all a grift. It's all a scam. And exploiting people's desperation and their inability to exercise patience is what allows these businesses and scams to leverage their own business upon. So, this is quite a fascinating hadith that I came across. And now I would like to discuss serotonin's role in sabr specifically. So, how does serotonin enter into the Islamic realm of patience and sabr? Now, I'll read some notes that I've made from researching this subject. So, first of all, I'll begin with Diane. I apologize for butchering the name. The paper, which is Serotonin in Affective Control. Right? So, firstly, serotonin plays a key role in behavioural suppression and inhibition. Suppression meaning decreasing and lowering the intensity. Inhibition means stopping, coming to a halt, which are necessary for patience. Number 2, it helps regulate aversive processing. Averse is something that causes displeasure, meaning it allows a person to endure difficult experiences without it impulsively seeking immediate relief. Number 3, and a lack of serotonin is associated with impulsivity and reduced ability to delay gratification. So, making it central to developing sabr. So, a lack of serotonin causes impulsive behavior. This is how, for example, online videos, porn is what I'm pointing to that here, which of course is run, managed, developed, and founded by the tiny hat coin clippers. This causes impulsive decisions and also reduces the ability to delay gratification and be content with what one has. Okay, and an interesting reference I found within this paper was of uniform inhibition of dopamine neurons in the VTA, and I found this interesting. I'll post this on the screen. It's a reference within this paper. So this possibly supports the fact that hard times indeed are needed to build character and exercise sabr. This is why Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam took part in almost 30, I believe 28 battles and expeditions of the 95 that the Muslims were part of. And I have a TikTok series on this, which you can go on at Mind Matter Meaning, and I briefly speak about this. Of course, I primarily use Wikipedia, and I use Wikipedia as long as the references are correct and it makes sense. Otherwise, I choose to go to those sources that use primary and secondary resources compiled in an article or a scientific journal or even in a book. So, fascinating paper which outlines these key aspects of serotonin and patience. Now, this reminds me of another hadith I came across in Jamia Tirmidhi regarding patience. So the hadith is the following. So Anas narrated that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "When Allah wants good for his slave, he hastens his punishment in the world. And when he wants bad for his slave, he withholds his sins from him until he appears before him on the day of judgment." And with this same chain, it was reported from Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who said, "Indeed, greater reward comes with greater trial. And indeed, when Allah loves a people, he subjects them to trials. So whoever is content, then for him is pleasure, and whoever is discontent, then for him is wrath." So again, we see how the role of our reactions have implications on the final judgment in front of Allah. So I would like to read the last sentence here, which is, And indeed, when Allah loves a people, He subjects them to trials. So whoever is content, then for him is pleasure. And whoever is discontent, then for him is wrath. So I would for sure say that there have been many situations where I have been discontent with my own life, and I was focusing on the pixel of the bad times and the bad moments rather than focusing on the bigger picture that Allah has given me. For example, clean water, clean clothes, the ability to make money, the ability to use and exercise my intellect, the ability to help the younger generation and some elders as well, the ability to serve my wife, my children, my family, and everyone around me in the best way I could in order to approach conflicts and come to a point of resolution where both parties are satisfied. So this ability to exercise my intellect is something that I certainly took for granted, and may Allah forgive me for my shortcomings, and may Allah forgive all of us. Allahumma ajirni minan nar. Allah protect us from the hellfire. Ameen. So now going back to serotonin and particularly the topic of impulse control. According to, again, Diane's work, this paper discusses serotonin's role in behavioral inhibition, meaning it helps suppress impulsive actions. Number 2, serotonin is involved in predicting future aversion outcomes, making it crucial for self-control and avoiding risky behaviors. So serotonin allows us to have a glimpse of the future, or at least have an idea of what is coming forth before we are in that situation and we feel down, impatient, hasty, so on and so forth. Third, it suppresses escape behaviors when facing immediate punishment, and also limits exploration and impulsive appetitive behaviors. So I'm not saying exploration in terms of ADHD, but distractions in terms of, okay, I need to focus on A, but I'm now again distracted by B and C and D and E and so on. It's about remaining focused to the task, and that's why, as the Quran emphasizes, and I'm also emphasizing in this video, prayer is extremely important. It allows you to remain focused and it suppresses all the distractions around you. And for those who don't pray, I advise you read chapter 30 of the Qur'an, which will give you an idea as to why those who don't pray are not Muslims. And that was one of the life-changing surahs of my life, really. Lastly, in terms of self-control and serotonin. Serotonin influences how we evaluate long-term rewards versus short-term pleasure, directly relating to Islamic teachings on sabr and resisting the dunya's temptations. Now, I would actually like to speak about the psychopharmacology aspect of this, and a paper I found which really stood out, paper by Harris and Nutt. They write about the receptors 5-HT1A and 5-HT2A. So here are some notes I have made regarding this paper. So I'll display the paper here, and the paper is titled Serotonin and Brain Function, A Tale of Two Receptors. Now, regarding self-control, 5-HT2A receptors enhance behavioral flexibility, which means they contribute to a person's ability to shift from immediate desires, which are dopamine-driven impulses, to long-term strategies, which are serotonin-driven patience. A framework I like to use is called AMPT, AMPPT, approach, method, methodology, procedure, technique. And this is a technique used in process engineering. I'm not a process engineer, but again, this technique has really helped me in recent times. Number 2, reduced serotonin levels are linked to impulsive behavior. So studies on rats show that serotonin depletion leads to an inability to delay gratification, making them choose immediate rewards over long-term benefits. Lastly, an interesting thing I found about serotonin's role in coping with stress are the following from this paper. Number one, which is passive coping, in other words, stress tolerance, is that it's mediated by 5-HT1A receptor signaling. This pathway improves an individual's ability to endure stress. It promotes patience by modulating adverse mental states and reducing impulsive reactions. So clearly you can see there is a interesting and logical theme with serotonin and all that we are trying to seek, but yet we can't because we are constantly in that dopamine loop. Second is active coping, which is adaptability and change, which is extremely important for a Muslim. Whether you're moving countries, moving jobs, changing businesses, line of work, learning the Qur'an, the Hadith, so on and so forth. Now, this is driven by 5-HT2A receptor signaling. This pathway helps individuals actively confront and adapt to adversity when it becomes severe. So we can also see this in the life of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, how him and his companions were able to adapt and change not only the strategies of war, but also adapt to their strategy and approach to da'wah, whether it was in Mecca or Medina. Now, going back to serotonin and impulsive control for a moment here. Despite the findings and our Deen's emphasis on prayer, charity, patience, and enhancing one's quality of life through delayed gratification, we still seem to be drawn to immediate rewards over long-term ones, and we see this in the theory of behavioral economics. And there's an idea in behavioral economics which ties with impulsive control, decision-making, and patience, which is delayed discounting. So it's an interesting paper from Brazil called Delayed Discounting Concepts and Measures. So let's consider its various definitions first, and inshallah you'll see how this actually relates to everything I've been speaking about so far. So delay discounting can be defined as the cognitive process that allows the individual to compare values between the immediate and delayed consumption of a determined commodity. Such a concept plays an important role in studies related to self-control and impulsiveness in decision-making. Definitions of delay discounting can be found in different forms. Some definitions focus on the magnitude, such as the depreciation in the value of reward, related to the time that it takes to be released, or the depreciation of the subjective value of a consequence when it is delayed. Other definitions focus on the individual, such as the tendency to prefer smaller and more immediate rewards to larger, perhaps more advantageous rewards that are released later, or the choice of a reward or consequence of a lower value that is released immediately over the alternative, supposing that the value of the greater and later reward is devalued. So you can clearly see how time plays a very crucial and important aspect here. And this all actually ties into time as well, which I will touch upon as we draw towards the end here. Thus, high rates of delay discounting are found in subjects who are willing to forego greater rewards that are available after some time and who show a preference for small, immediately available rewards. Some authors refer to the tendencies of subjects to conceptualize delay discounting. Importantly, however, although individuals may differ with regard to delay discounting in the form or degree to which the delayed results depreciate, delayed discounting must be considered as a behavioral tendency that can change under different environmental or pharmacological conditions rather than as a fixed trait. So again, you can see how the pharmacological, the Islamic, the neuroscientific, and the psychological and the behavioral aspect all encompass into this idea of decision making, delayed gratification, patience, and the behavior of being hasty and hurrying yourself towards a reward or a gain of some form. Now look, despite all of this, we see how man is hasty with acquiring as much material wealth as he can and neglects the world to come at the expense of time. So by the world, I mean the actual reality of the hereafter. That's the actual world, the eternal of Jannah or Jahannam. And all these pursuits are done at the expense of time, which is fleeting, and really all gains lead to the inevitable loss of man. In fact, this is not me, this is what the Qur'an speaks about, and chapter 103 speaks about this in great detail, known as Surah Al-Asr. Surah Al-Asr is time through the ages, and it's a surah that majority of us learn when we are young. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wal Asr. Innal insana lafi khusr. Illa alladhina amanu wa amilu salihati wa tawasaw bil haqqi wa tawasaw bis sabr. And so, Sadaqallahu Azim. 3 verses essentially highlight everything that we've spoken about so far, and this surah approximates to English as, by the token of time through the ages, verily man is in loss, except such as have faith and do righteous deed and join together in the mutual teaching of the truth and of patience and constancy. So I found this surah really culminates everything I've discussed so far, and the neuroscience aspect certainly can be discussed more deeply, but I do feel like at the end of the day, we need practical steps as well. So, number 1 is reduce dopamine distraction, social media, consumerism, following the new trends. Being around people who are involved in these type of activities, cut them off, doesn't matter. Even if it's your sibling or parent, in a nice way, distance yourself, because it's affecting your akhirah. Number 2 is increase serotonin building habits. Exercise. Various forms of exercise. These days I like to do weights and punching. Of course, salah, dhikr, shukr, wa sabr. Thirdly is shift your goals to the akhirah and not just the dunya. And that means investing, for example, in projects where you can have enough material resource to aid in the funding of a mosque, a hospital, a water pump, and leave behind beneficial knowledge, and of course build a legacy through having children, getting married, so you avoid watching porn and inappropriate material, which helps regulate your serotonin and helps you remain patient, especially given the nature of woman. A man must be patient at all times, not only with his wife but also his children. So there is a hadith that speaks about this, that 3 things will reward a man after he passes away: children who pray for him, righteous children who pray for him, beneficial knowledge, books, podcasts, videos, so on and so forth, and number 3, ongoing charity. So these are things that we must take into account. We must take into account if we are sincere and genuinely looking to improve ourselves. I did this approximately 5.5 or so years ago. It's been a journey up and down, made many mistakes. Alhamdulillah, I learned from them and I contemplate and reflect. Certainly, this is not a race, but for a Muslim, it's a marathon. At the end of the day, help the ummah or die trying. Till next time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.